I walked into the animal shelter. The place gave me the creeps. It was quiet, and the air felt heavy. The smell of disinfectant mixed with a strange odor made me wrinkle my nose. I wanted to adopt a dog, and this place was my last resort. The lady at the front desk looked tired. I filled out some papers, and she handed me a key, telling me my new dog was in the basement. The stairs creaked as I descended. It was dim, and the only light came from a flickering bulb at the end of the hallway. The sound of barking grew louder as I got closer. When I opened the door to the basement, I froze. The room was filled with dogs, but they weren't what I expected. Their fur was matted and dirty, and they had a wild look in their eyes. They barked and howled, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony of fear and anger. I found the dog I was supposed to adopt. It was a small, trembling creature in the corner. I reached out to pet it, and it snapped at my hand. I pulled back, surprised. I looked around the room again, and that's when I noticed something strange. All the dogs had the same eerie, human-like eyes. They stared at me with a disturbing intensity, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I decided to leave the basement and ask the lady at the front desk about the dogs. As I turned to go, I heard a low, growling sound behind me. I glanced back and saw the dogs were slowly advancing, their eyes fixed on me. I hurried up the stairs, my heart pounding. I found the lady at the front desk and asked her about the dogs in the basement. She just gave me a blank stare and said they were all perfectly normal. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I went back to the basement, hoping to get a better look at the dogs. But when I opened the door, they were gone. The room was empty, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. I left the shelter without adopting a dog, and I never went back. The whole experience had been too unsettling. I couldn't explain what I had seen in the basement, but it felt like I had stepped into a nightmare. A few weeks later, I heard a news report about the animal shelter. It had been shut down due to allegations of animal cruelty. The authorities had found evidence of mistreatment and neglect, and the owner was facing charges. I couldn't help but wonder about those dogs I'd seen in the basement. What had happened to them? Were they victims of the shelter's cruelty, or was there something more sinister at play? I'll never know for sure, but I'm just glad I got out of there when I did. I went to the animal shelter to find a furry friend. The place looked normal from the outside, just a regular building in my small town. As I walked in, I heard the dogs barking and the cats meowing. It was crowded with people looking for pets, but something about the place felt off. I started looking around at the animals in their cages. There was a sense of sadness in their eyes. They seemed anxious, like they were hiding from something. The shelter worker who showed me around had a weird smile, and her eyes didn't seem friendly. I finally found a cute little puppy. It was wagging its tail, so I thought it was happy. I decided to adopt it and fill out the paperwork. The worker told me to wait for a bit, so I sat down in the waiting area. While waiting, I overheard a couple of people talking. They were saying that the shelter had a strange history. Some said that the animals weren't treated well here, and others claimed they'd seen strange things at night. I thought it was just gossip, but it made me uneasy. As I waited, the lights in the shelter flickered. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. I felt a chill down my spine. It was a hot day, so there was no reason for the lights to be acting that way. Finally, the worker returned with my new puppy. She handed it to me and said, "Take good care of it. It's a special one." Her tone was cold, and her eyes had a strange glint. I took the puppy home, and everything seemed fine at first. It was playful and seemed to like me. But at night, things changed. I heard strange noises in my house, like scratching and whimpering. I got up to check on the puppy, but it was sound asleep. The next night, the noises continued, and I saw shadowy figures moving around. It was as if the walls had eyes, and they were watching me. I felt like I was being haunted. I tried to stay calm, but it was getting harder. One evening, I decided to do some research on the shelter. I found an old news article about it. It mentioned that the shelter was built on an old cemetery. The article said that some people believed the spirits of the buried bodies still lingered, and that's why the animals there acted strangely. I was scared, but I needed to find out more. I asked some of my neighbors if they'd had any strange experiences with the shelter's animals. Some said they'd adopted pets from there, but the animals had always been weird and had a sense of sorrow about them. I decided to go back to the shelter to talk to the worker. When I arrived, the place was even creepier than before. The animals were all eerily quiet, and the worker's smile was gone. She seemed angry, her eyes were dark, and she spoke in a low, threatening voice. I asked her about the shelter's history, and she reluctantly confirmed the old cemetery story. She said they tried to exorcise the place, but the spirits still haunted the shelter. She added, "Sometimes those spirits find a new home in the pets we rescue." I was shocked and scared. I knew I had to get my puppy out of that place. But when I got home, the puppy had changed. Its eyes were different, filled with a sadness that wasn't there before. It didn't seem like the same puppy I had adopted. The strange noises in my house got louder and more disturbing. It was as if the spirits from the shelter had followed us. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to return the puppy to the shelter and demand my money back. When I got there, the place was even darker and more sinister. The worker was nowhere to be found. I left the puppy in its cage and left in a hurry. As I walked away, I heard a whisper in the wind saying, "You can't escape us." I never went near that shelter again, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something from that place had latched onto me. The puppy, the shelter, and the spirits haunted my dreams. It was a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I went to the animal shelter one sunny day. It was a small place with old brick walls and a rusty sign. I pushed the creaky door and a bell jingled above me. The shelter was dark, and the smell was a mix of wet fur and something strange. The lady behind the counter had sad eyes. She looked tired. I asked to see the dogs. She nodded and led me to a hallway. I followed her into a room with cages. Dogs of all sizes and colors were inside. They barked and whined, and it was deafening. The lady pointed to a cage in the corner. There was a dog inside. It was a big German shepherd. It looked scared, but I thought I could give it a better life. The lady handed me a leash, and I opened the cage. The dog stepped out, but it was shivering. I bent down to pet it. It was cold, like ice. I looked at the lady, but she just smiled sadly. I decided to take the dog home. As we walked to my car, I noticed something strange. The dog had no shadow. It was as if it wasn't there, but I could touch it. At home, I tried to make the dog comfortable. I gave it food, but it didn't eat. It just sat in the corner, staring at me with its empty eyes. I petted it, but its fur felt like needles. That night, I couldn't sleep. The dog's presence was unsettling. I heard weird noises from the kitchen. When I went to check, the fridge door was open, and all the food was on the floor. I thought maybe the dog did it, but it was still in the corner, staring. I cleaned up and went back to bed, but I heard whispers, like someone talking in another room. The next day, things got even stranger. I found paw prints on the ceiling, and the TV turned on by itself. The dog was always there, watching me, but it didn't act like a normal dog. I decided to call the animal shelter and ask about the dog. The lady on the phone sounded surprised when I described it. She told me that they never had a German shepherd there. I must have mistaken it for another dog. I was confused. I hung up and turned to the dog, but it was gone. I searched the whole house, but it had disappeared. I felt relief, but also fear. That night I heard footsteps in the hallway. I followed the sound and found the dog sitting at the end of the hall. It was staring at a door, one that I had never noticed before. I opened the door, and it led to a small room. It was freezing inside, and there was a sense of dread. I felt like I shouldn't go in, but the dog went inside. It looked at me and then vanished. I decided to brave it and went inside. In the middle of the room, there was an old, dusty mirror. I looked at my reflection, but it wasn't me. It was a twisted version of myself, with hollow eyes and a wicked smile. I stumbled back, but I couldn't move. The mirror showed me terrible things, visions of death and despair. I was trapped, and I couldn't look away. The room grew colder, and the whispers from the mirror grew louder. They spoke of pain and suffering, of a darkness that would never end. I screamed, but no sound came out. I don't know how long I was trapped in that room, but it felt like an eternity. When I finally broke free, I was back in my own body, but I was changed. I could still hear the whispers, and I knew they would never leave me. I had to get rid of the mirror. I smashed it into a million pieces and threw it away. The dog was gone, and the strange occurrences stopped, but I knew the darkness was still with me. Now I can't sleep. I see the mirror in my dreams, and the whispers haunt me. I should have never gone to that animal shelter. I should have never brought home that dog. My life is forever scarred by the horror that lurked in the shadows. I walked into the animal shelter on a cloudy day. It was a small place with dogs and cats in cages. The air felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started looking at the animals, hoping to find a new pet. As I walked down the rows of cages, a strange smell hit me. It was like something rotten. I tried to ignore it and focused on the animals. In one of the cages there was a cat. It had bright green eyes and was meowing loudly. I thought it was just hungry or scared, but the sound sent shivers down my spine. It was like the cat was begging for something, but I couldn't figure out what. I moved on to the dogs. They were barking and jumping, eager for attention. But their barks were different, not the usual happy ones. It was as if they were warning me to leave. I brushed it off as them being stressed. I decided to talk to the shelter worker. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. I asked her about the strange smell and the odd behavior of the animals. She just shrugged it off, saying it was an old building and the animals were probably anxious. I picked a friendly-looking dog and filled out the adoption papers. As I was leaving, I noticed a door at the back of the shelter. It was slightly ajar, and a flickering light came from inside. I couldn't resist my curiosity and pushed the door open. Inside, I found a room filled with cages, but these cages were different. They were covered with strange symbols, and the air was colder. In one of the cages there was a small animal, unlike any I had ever seen. It had black, beady eyes and long, bony fingers. It looked at me, and I had a goosebumps. I quickly left the room and went to the shelter worker. I asked her about the strange room, but she acted like she didn't know what I was talking about. She said I must have imagined it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that place. I took my new dog home, but it didn't take long for strange things to happen. At night, I would hear whispers coming from the dog. It was like it was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand. The dog's behavior became more moody, and it would often bark at the empty corner of the room. One night, as I was lying in bed, I saw a shadowy figure in the corner of the room. It was the same creature I had seen in the shelter. It stared at me with its black eyes and I couldn't move. It whispered in a language I didn't understand, and I felt a deep sense of dread. I decided to return the dog to the shelter, but when I got there, the entire place had changed. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols, and the air was freezing. The animals in the cages had grown more grotesque, with sharp teeth and wild eyes. I looked for the shelter worker, but she was nowhere to be found. It was as if the entire place had been taken over by something evil. I couldn't find the exit, and the walls seemed to close in on me. As I walked through the creepy shelter, I heard the whispers of the animals. They were not begging for love, but for release from their suffering. It was then that I realized that the shelter was a front for something far more evil. I finally found the room with the strange symbols, and the creature was waiting for me. It reached out with its bony fingers, and I felt a searing pain in my chest. I screamed as it dragged me into its cage, and the world around me turned into a nightmare. I woke up in a cold sweat in my own bed. It had all been a terrible dream. I rushed to the shelter to return the dog, but the place was just as I had seen it in my dream. The symbols, the cold air, and the dark creatures were all real. I couldn't find the shelter worker, and I never went back. The scary things I saw were too much, and I felt like the shelter was a door to something really bad.